Uh, Hello, everyone. Today we wanted to talk to you a little bit about the notion of social value in the context of British Antarctic Heritage sites. And it is quite late in the day, so try and keep it light. And there'll be an opportunity for interactivity and questions as we go. First, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on UKHT, or the Antarctic Heritage Trust, before we get into the subject proper. And at this point, I'd like to give our thanks to the team at UKHT who have supported us in our work for today. So, UCAT is a charity that maintains and protects 6 Antarctic heritage sites. These are former bases which are protected under the Antarctic Treaty on account of the historical importance of them as sites of British heritage, scientific study and human endeavour in the most extreme of conditions. The first British base was established in 1944 under the wartime operation called Operation Tabarin, and from here, and from the following bases that were established, they surveyed the topography of the peninsula and undertook meteorological and scientific studies across the peninsula and surrounding areas. The organisational structure and work undertaken here was the foundation of the British Antarctic Survey as we know it today. So these bases all began and ceased activity at separate times. As they are now heritage sites, they're no longer staffed with the exception of our key site at Port Lochroy, which is a small Antarctic team during the austral summer, who staff the base as a museum, a post office and a shop. And this team can welcome up to 18,000 tourists each year. Each of the bases, as you can see on the slide there, are unique in structure, in location. Some had American neighbours, some had sled dog teams, and some had aircraft landing sites. But all of them were sites of shared experiences by those who worked there. And whilst the sites have recognised historical importance and of increasing heritage value as shown in their historic site and monument status, if you have the opportunity to read the reports or listen to the oral testimonies, it becomes very clear that the sites themselves, the places, became hugely important to the few men who worked there, even though the staff were on site for a limit of 2 to 3 years, and therefore the static base communities had a rolling inhabitant register. The experience of overwintering in such a remote and extreme place appears from the evidence to have been very powerful in creating community bonds and connections to the bases, resulting in the men holding the place, the environment and the community experience in high value, even after several decades away. This meaningful and collective attachment to place can be considered a social value as per the Jones-Inleach definition of 2015. Collective attachment to place that embodies meanings and values that are important to a community or communities. I think it's of particular interest that these collective attachments of values to place were not only being potentially rewritten frequently by the changing cast of characters, but that with the building of each new base, these social values were frequently being started from scratch, entire and new mini communities in the wilderness, as it were. Now, I've said that UKHT maintain and conserve these heritage sites, and consideration and attention to social value is becoming an increasingly important component of those practices and policies, particularly since the publication of the 1979 Borough Charter, whereupon the intangible cultural significant aspects of heritage sites began to be much more centrally considered and social value itself considered more deeply. But you'll recall that I mentioned that in the main, these sites are no longer in service, most not in service for more than a generation. Some questions which are those in preparation for this talk were, can social value exist in absentia? Can it continue to exist in an extremely dispersed community? Or to get to the gist of our talk today, can it exist virtually? I've noted that the staff and therefore communities of the bases were constantly changing. I don't believe this eradicates the concept of social value from Antarctic bases, only that it means it exists in what you might call a sped up microcosm, with the evidence of past social value evident in the archives of British Antarctic Survey and UKHT. So, can we re-inhabit place in absentia? Can we establish or re-establish social value through virtual Antarctic communities? If less than 20,000 people per year can visit our key base in person, and a tiny proportion of the world's population, and a tiny proportion of that tiny proportion can visit any of our other 5 bases, how do we approach this issue? As such, UKHT has and is undertaking a series of digitisation projects within their field operations, and we've been generously permitted access to the data as well as content from the British Antarctic Survey archives for this talk today, so we extend our thanks for both. So Emily and I are here today to consider the notion that we can use technology, in this example WebXR, to build, recreate something of that collective attachment to place through embodied social interaction in a virtual space, trying to duplicate something of that sense of place. Now, this is very early research and we're just scratching the surface, and we decided to do this interactive setup quite late on, so do bear with us if there's any technical issues. But we'd like to invite you as a presently collected community to join us in exploring collectively a virtual 3D space of one of our UKH bases, and that is Damoy, established in 1974 as an airport transit base. So that's all the background and foundational spiel. I'll pass over to Emily now to talk a bit more about WebXR.
Awesome, thank you. Answers on a postcard, greatly appreciated for how alternative ways that this might happen rather than the ways that we've defaulted to. So I thought I'd give some sort of context and framing from where I'm coming at this, and then I'll explain about WebXR. And then in theory, if the technology works, we should be able to jump in and try it. I think they need to update the saying that you shouldn't work with children animals. They should have technology on that, especially on a live video call when it's being recorded. So virtual heritage, I'm not sure how familiar humans here are with this term. There's been numerous definitions. Initially, it started as a fusion between virtual reality technology and cultural heritage. It's gone on to encompass various different pieces of technology as technologies iterate, as they seem to do quite quickly nowadays. So the sort of distinct sort of difficulty that I personally have, and we've sort of picked up on with a lot of virtual heritage, is the reliance on heavily technical resources and expensive and inaccessible hardware, which has kind of led us on to why we've decided to work with WebXR. So what is WebXR in a nice concise bullet point for a slide? It's an API for web content and apps to use to interface with mixed reality hardware such as VR headsets, all the way through to augmented reality features, all the way through to, I should imagine most humans are at arm's reach from a smartphone. There's a human called Eric Champion who argues we cannot afford to have our digital heritage disappearing quicker than the real heritage it seeks to preserve. That's a paraphrase. I think I've hit most of the bases on that. So we're interested in avoiding this sort of technical obsolescence, but there's also a nice sort of theme going on between the ideas of obsolescence with technologies, place, communities. So there's some sort of nice sort of threads running through. So why WebXR? We've chosen it because we want to work and develop ways that are workflows for non-expert users. A lot of collections are managed by tiny groups of humans, volunteers. So making it accessible, not just on a technical hardware sense, but the software and interaction, the idea that audiences could go from being passive consumers to actually being creators. But also the rapid prototyping and deployment, and anyone who's tried to publish anything on Steam, iOS, etc. How can we avoid these App Store gatekeepers that are holding us in the metaverse? So we've decided to work with WebXR, but we're also keen to make sure everything we do in the Paradata is accessible. There was a recent literature review by Eric Champion I think it looked at circa 1,500 conference papers. Of those 1,500 papers, I think 200 to 300 had 3D models that you could access, and then maybe a dozen of those were actually working models that you could get, and then about 9 of them actually worked, but then most of them were in obsolete file formats. So working in the web browser is a way of making sure we sort of dodge obsolescence, and where the WebXR element sort of comes in. We also think and have noted that, and it's been commented and picked up in some of the earlier talks today, the role of avatars and the ideas of presence. Many different video games have been discussed today, some that are solitary RPGs through to multi-player experiences. And we think that avatars and being able to experience this with other humans goes beyond those sort of traditional experiences that you might get in sort of the museum sort of context, where you're there, you've got some quite clunky, expensive hardware, and you're experiencing it on your own. What meaning does that have, or how does it change your behaviors when you're with other humans? So we're interested in how that can change it. So bear with us. I'm going to put a link to this in the chat. We've used a platform called Mozilla Spoke and Mozilla Hubs. Mozilla Spoke, for anyone who's interested in this, it's a bit like a mini sort of games engine, but it's more friendly to develop the environment. And then Mozilla Hubs is the environment that you publish it in. It's started just before lockdown, so it was kind of handy that it was developed prior to the lockdown. And it's a social VR experience predominantly, I believe, and we've chosen to use this because it runs natively in the web browser. If you randomly have a VR headset within arm's reach, whether you have a smartphone within arm's reach, whatever it is, if you'd like to join us in this web link, I'm going to pop this in the chat and we'll see you in that experience. I will copy this link and stop sharing screen, and hopefully carnage will not ensue. I'll go to the last slide just in case, just a reminder to thank UKHT and the Bassett Archives, and if anyone has any questions, I can leave that up there for a second whilst I frantically copy and paste that web link into the chat and a web browser. For anyone who's never used it, it's reliant on your broadband connection. I live in the middle of nowhere. It's a bit slow, so you might load into it quicker than me if you're a human with fibre optic broadband. I'm also very jealous if you've got fibre optic broadband. And we will stop the screen sharing. I'll pop the link in the chat.
We'll try and get in, and one of us will screen share our point of view for anyone who can't access or doesn't wish to access Mozilla Hubs directly. If anyone has any questions about the space or questions that we'd just like to bring forward about the topic, please do so.
Okay, can humans see Mozilla Hubs?
Yes.
Yeah, that looks great.
Just going to open up Teams on another screen in case there are questions popping up.
So we'll give people a few minutes to have a bash if they want, in order to fill the void, as it were. As I said, this is Damoy. This was one of our aircraft deployment bases. So in getting to some of our other more remote sites, this is where people would fly into, and then they'd have to wait for clear weather conditions in order to access other locations. The capacity for the people to occasionally be accidentally stranded at Damoy on account of the weather led the inhabitants to refer to it as HMP Damoy, Her Majesty's Prison, as once you were there, if the weather turned, there was no getting out. Once you're in the space and you've had a little explore, you can see that we've got some images up of the surrounding environment, so you can get an idea of the landscape it's within. Often referred to as one of the most beautiful places in the world. You can kind of see why. Everyone's a bit jealous of the team who get to go down, not myself, unfortunately. And if you head towards the front door, there's a little picture to the left with a very bright orange image on it, a bright orange hut. If you click on that, you can move to another scene, and that takes you to a very basic interior. The reason that the hut in the other scene is bright orange is that is its authentic historical colour, or one of, I should say. And as I said, it was an aircraft landing site. So if you're landing an aircraft, you want to be able to see where you're going and where you're navigating by. So a nice bright colour was the best way to do that. The interior of the building is not too large. It has 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 bunks. On occasion, there were up to 26 people trapped in Damoy on account of the weather and layovers. I think they had to eat in shifts that day. In order to keep themselves busy, they got pretty creative. They created their own games, such as Fidopoly, a topical riff on the more popular Monopoly game. We're tempted to commercialise, but it's too close, unfortunately. But maybe we can do something with it, try and get Fidopoly out into the world. I should explain, FID is the term for people who are British and worked in Antarctica before it became BAS. It was the Falkland Island Dependency Survey. And historically, people who worked for the previous BAS still, even if they work for BAS now, often refer to themselves as FIDs. It's got quite a esteemed status. And I guess that ties in with the social value. It becomes a community of self-identification. So there's quite a lot of being part of the club, I guess. It's a very unique bunch of people who have had the pleasure and the capacity to be able to spend winters in this most extreme of locations. The team that have gone down or will go down this winter coming are very excited to do so. And if you would like to be in the running to go next year, keep an eye on the UKHT latest news webpage. If anyone has any questions inside of Mozilla, I believe you can turn on your mic and speak to us directly. There should be some audio sounds. If there's not, perhaps refresh your browser. I think one of the things I enjoy most about Damoy is that they never even bothered to paint the interior. It's just bare boards, solid ply, still standing after 50 years. All the more of an achievement when you realise that these were built by amateurs. These huts were flat packs sent down with scientists, general assistants, meteorologists to construct themselves, hopefully under good weather. Oh, it's the same.
Yeah, I've noticed all the sounds and things. Are these just like generic sounds, or have they been like actually recorded for this?
These
So
ones,
the-
I think,
Sorry.
I was going to ask Emily.
Mhm.
No, the penguins, you should, if you're hearing penguins, that is from an extract from audio taken from a recording from a site visit by a human whose name I can't remember. Authentic penguin noises.
Oh wow.
This site is very close to our key base at Port Lockroy, which has a colony of penguins and has done since the 80s. We didn't move in next to the penguins moved in next to us. So now each year the team also partake of a penguin survey and count how many penguins there are at the start, middle and end of season, and keep an eye on how many eggs and chicks are hatched and born and thrive on site. So it's still adjacent to a site of scientific study.
That's great. Oh,
I can stop sharing screen if humans have had enough time The link is in there, so if you want to explore it at a later date, you're more than welcome to. I don't know if Lesley have anything else to add, but I'll stop sharing screen because my laptop sounds like it's going to take off. That's Teams, it's not the WebXR.
Shall we
no, that's fine.
reconvene? Yes, we're hoping that we can tap into WebXR technology as well as other technologies in order to see if we can help people connect with the sites. It's never going to be quite the same as being in Antarctica in physical presence, being there yourself, but as it's such a challenging place to get to, it could become the next best thing. So if there are ideas, suggestions, questions, please feel free to bring them on. Comments on my slightly hurried weekend modeling.
No, I think that was brilliant, and I think it could be used in a lot of different ways. So what ways are you using it? Are you using it for like educational purposes or just your own research?
At the moment, WebXR is a key part of Emily's research. In terms of UKHT in Antarctica, we are working on, as I said, digitizing the sites. So that falls under for documentation and conservation purposes. But we're also working on virtual outreach. So we're using Unity, virtual reality experiences, which does have a bit more accurate models, authentic sounds, authentic stories from the archives. We've got 80 years worth of stories and we want to share them. So we're using Unity for that at the moment and developing it. But it's great having a potential Unity build that we can give to schools, which is the intention for this, particularly the Scottish curriculum, because it's been identified as a gap. But using something like WebXR, it can almost be a follow-up. So if a class has experience of the virtual reality experience, we can then take them into Mozilla, even a simplified version, and they can have a one-to-one with our building conservator or their CEO or the Antarctic team who have just been there, then ask all of their questions. So being able to work with the same models across platform is quite a valuable thing.
That sounds brilliant. Thank you so much for the presentation. If there's no more questions, then I think we can wrap up there. But thank you so much. It was just exciting getting to see the Antarctic.
Thank you.